The first thing Cale Doran registered was the cold. Not the familiar bite of a pressurized corridor or the managed chill of a ship's lower decks. This was real cold, ground cold, the kind that moves upward through the body and takes root somewhere behind the sternum. He lay on his back. Above him, sky. An alien sky, the wrong shade of purple-gray, 2 moons visible even in daylight, both crescent and pale. He had no immediate memory of how he'd come to be looking at it. The second thing he registered was that he was not alone. She was sitting beside him, cross-legged on the ground, close enough that the hem of her outer covering, some layered, worn thing in dark gray and brown, brushed his arm. Her attention was on the tree line to the northeast, and she was very still in the way of someone who had been still for a long time and had made a decision about it. Her skin was a deep, muted violet blue, not the bioluminescent variety he'd read about in the species catalogs, just the natural pigment of her, even and smooth across what he could see of her forearms and the line of her jaw. Her hair was dark, almost black, cut unevenly as though she'd done it herself in poor light, and it was damp at the edges the way hair gets in cold air when you've been exerting yourself. Her ears came to a soft, angular point. Her eyes, when she finally turned to look at him, were a pale, extraordinary gold, not warm gold, not amber, a clear mineral gold like light through a quartz window. She did not look surprised that he was awake. She looked as though she had been waiting for it. Cale tried to sit up. The left side of his torso informed him, at considerable volume, that this was inadvisable. He made it halfway before the pain broke through the fog and he had to stop, breathing carefully, one hand pressed flat against the ground. "Slowly," she said. Her standard was accented, the vowels slightly compressed, the consonants landing with the precision of someone who had learned the language from a text rather than from speaking it around people. But it was unmistakable standard, clear and usable. He hadn't expected that. He didn't know what he'd expected. "How long?" he said. "Since you fell, 11 hours. She turned back to the tree line. "You did not fall the way someone falls when they are dying. You fell the way someone falls when they have decided their body has done enough for now." He almost laughed. The cost of it reminded him not too accurate. He lay back down. The ground beneath him was not bare. She put something under him, some bundled fabric, and there was a thin thermal layer pulled across his midsection that was not his own equipment. He noticed this without comment. He also noticed that there was a small fire, very low and nearly smokeless, burning about a meter to his left, and that the site had been chosen with deliberate care. A depression in the ground, tree cover above, rock face at the back. She'd made camp. In 11 hours, while he was unconscious, she had made camp. "You moved me," he said. "A little, not far. You were heavy." She said it without inflection, as a fact about the physical world. "You didn't have to." "No," she agreed. She did not say anything further. Cale studied the sky again. He was a geological survey specialist, second-hand contracted to the Compact's Frontier Assessment Bureau, 6 years of it, most of them on worlds that had not yet decided whether they wanted to be hospitable. He was not unused to difficult circumstances. He was, however, unused to waking up on the wrong side of a collapsed survey shaft with an alien woman watching his breathing and making no demands about it. He tried to reconstruct the previous 48 hours. The shaft, the rock fall, the secondary fissure he hadn't known was there. He'd been doing a routine geological assessment of the valley's mineral strata when the ground had simply decided to renegotiate the terms of the arrangement. He remembered the sound first, a low, structural complaint from somewhere deep, and then the shaft wall folding inward with the patient certainty of something that had been planning this for a long time. He'd run before he'd fully decided to run, the body faster than the mind in those situations, scrambling up the access ladder with one boot still catching on the lower rung when the floor came down. The surface had been dark when he'd broken out of it, deep evening, the sky that particular shade of alien purple that meant it was well past useful light, and he'd run along the ridge because standing still felt like an invitation. He remembered running. He remembered the moment his body had simply declined to continue, a sudden, total withdrawal of cooperation, knees giving, the ground coming up fast. He had a specific, vivid memory of thinking, in the fraction of a second before impact, that this was a very inconvenient time and place to discover his limits. He didn't remember her, not from before. "Were you in the valley?" he asked, "before the shaft went?" "On the far ridge, I saw the shaft collapse." She paused. "I also saw you run from it." "How far did I run?" 4 kilometers, give or take. The faintest shift in her expression, not quite a smile. "You are fast for someone running on one functional side." The ribs, then, he'd suspected. He moved his arm carefully, assessed the wrap around his torso, firm, professional, done with actual understanding of the anatomy rather than a panicked first-aid guess. Someone who knew where the ribs were and how they needed support. "You wrapped my ribs." "I have some medical training, field level." Another pause. "I also found your kit. It was 20 meters back from where you fell. I retrieved it." He turned his head. His survey kit was there, battered pack, beacon, the emergency case. All of it. She'd gone back in the dark, on unfamiliar ground, and found his kit and carried it to him. He looked at it for a moment, noting the careful way it had been organized. The emergency case on top, accessible, the heavier items redistributed toward the bottom. She'd been through it systematically, not rummaging. "Thank you," he said. It felt inadequate. She accepted it with a slight inclination of her head, the way someone accepts thanks when they don't place much weight on whether they receive it or not. "I'm Kale," he said. "Sarath," she said. He didn't know the species name from it. There were too many frontier populations, too many uncharted groups in this region of the compact's outer rim. He knew enough to know that she wasn't Velthoran, the coloring was wrong, the ear shape subtly different, and wasn't from any of the 3 catalog species on this particular world settlement register, which meant she was either unregistered or she was someone who had reason not to be in the register. The outer rim had both categories, in numbers that didn't show up in the official counts. He filed this away and said nothing about it. "You should eat," she said. "I have rations. They're yours from your kit. I didn't touch them." A brief pause. "I have some of my own if you want variety. They won't taste correct to you, but they won't harm you. Your species and mine are compatible. Close enough for basic nutrition, not for everything." The ghost of that not quite smile again. "Do not eat my harach seeds. They'll make you feel like the ground is moving." Noted. He thought about sitting up again and decided to negotiate with his ribs first, taking stock of exactly which movements were available and which weren't. Sitting up was available. Anything involving a left side torque was not. He filed these parameters and worked within them. "What are you doing on this world?" The question sat in the air for a moment. She watched the tree line, passing through. "Long way to pass through." "Yes." He'd worked frontier postings long enough to know when a line of inquiry had reached its natural end. He let it rest. "My beacon's intact," he said. "I should signal the relay, get a pickup window." "The relay is not responding," she said it matter-of-factly. "I checked your equipment when I was organizing the camp. The beacon is functional. The relay is not. There's an atmospheric event, charged particles, upper layer. It's been building for 2 days. Nothing is getting through until it passes." "How long?" 3 days. Perhaps 4. He absorbed this. 3 or 4 days on the ground with cracked ribs in a world he'd just been trying to leave quickly. He ran through the practical arithmetic, food and water from his kit, thermal management, the site she'd chosen. The site was genuinely good. The depression cut the wind. The rock face behind them absorbed and radiated heat from the fire. The tree cover above broke up any visual signature from aerial survey if that were a concern. She hadn't chosen it at random. "All right," he said. "All right," she agreed, and went back to watching the tree line. He slept again in the afternoon. He didn't mean to, he simply became aware mid-thought that several hours had passed and the light had shifted. When he woke the second time he felt clearer, less submerged, and was able to sit up with only a sharp, manageable complaint from his left side. Sarath was in approximately the same position, though the fire had been rebuilt, and there was something warming on a flat stone beside it. "Eat this," she said, handing him a sealed pack from his kit that he hadn't noticed she'd opened. "Then this." She handed him a flat, dark wafer, her food, he assumed. "The wafer is dense. It'll help with the cold." He ate. She was right on both counts. The wafer was dry and faintly bitter but dense in the way of food that knows it has work to do. After the first few minutes, the cold that had been sitting in his chest retreated to something manageable. He ate in silence for a while, paying attention to the sight again now that he had clearer eyes for it. She'd done more than choose the location well. There was a water collection system rigged from a section of his emergency tarp, simple, effective, catching the condensation from the nearby rock face and channeling it into his water canister. There was a windbreak constructed from deadfall on the open side of the depression, low enough not to obstruct the fire's draw, but positioned to interrupt the ground-level draft that would otherwise have made the site considerably colder. Small things, practical things done without announcement. "How bad are the ribs?" he asked. "Too cracked. One is borderline. I think it will resolve without displacement if you don't make any sudden movements for the next 6 days. You also have bruising across your left shoulder that will be significantly worse tomorrow than it is today. Looking forward to that. You should sleep on your right side." She picked up a flat piece of bark from beside her and turned it over in her hands, not absent-mindedly, with the focused quality of someone doing something small and purposeful. He realized after a moment that she was carving something into it, very slowly, with a small tool. Not for him, apparently, just because she had something to do with her hands while she watched. He watched her for a moment. The carving tool was small, something she'd made or adapted, by the look of it, from a piece of metal that had once been something else. Her hands were steady and precise, the marks going in exactly where she intended them. "Where are you trying to get to?" he asked, passing through to where. She was quiet for long enough that he thought she wasn't going to answer. Then, the resettlement node at Kelvar Station, Northern Transit Corridor. Kelvar, he knew it. Compact Processing Station, Midrim, one of the resettlement hubs for populations displaced by the boundary conflicts in the Outer Rim's Third Sector expansion. Large, busy, a lot of unregistered traffic moving through it. That's a long walk from here. "I have a transport arranged, at Dorath Port. 4 days from here, assuming the trail holds." 4 days on foot. "Yes." She turned the bark over again. "I was on schedule before the atmospheric event grounded everything. Now I have 3 days of nothing to do and a human with cracked ribs sitting on my route." "You didn't have to stop," he said. "When you saw the shaft collapse, you didn't have to follow." She looked at him then fully, the way she'd looked when he first opened his eyes, that clear gold assessment. "No," she agreed. "I didn't have to." She went back to the bark. He thought about asking more and decided not to. He'd been in enough difficult places to know the difference between someone who needed to talk and someone who needed quiet competence and no unnecessary questions. Sarath, he was coming to understand, was the second kind. Pressing her would not yield more information. It would only change the nature of the silence from comfortable to tense, and comfortable was working well. He watched the fire instead. Outside the depression, the wind had picked up, moving through the canopy in long, slow waves. The world was called Keth Doran, Class 3 Biosphere, catalogued 3 years ago, sparse settlement register, primarily of use for its mineral survey. Not a place people lived. A place people passed through or assessed or used as a waypoint. Both of them, then, were passing through, which gave them a kind of company that wasn't quite ordinary company. the particular solidarity of two people who are temporarily in the same inconvenient place. "Tell me about the trail," he said. "To Dorath. If I know the terrain, I'm not a liability." She looked at him again briefly. Something in her expression shifted, not much but perceptibly. "You're planning to walk. Assuming the ribs cooperate." "They won't, not for 4 days." She said it without judgment, just assessment. "You'll need 2 days before you can walk that distance. 2 days to rest, 2 days to the port. That's still ahead of the pickup window on my beacon." Another pause. She turned the bark over again. The trail crosses a river gorge at the 18-kilometer mark. The bridge is damaged. A section is missing about 2/3 of the way across. It can be crossed, but it requires some lateral movement along the edge structure. "With your ribs, it will be slow." "But possible." "Possible," she agreed. "Then tell me about it." She did. She spoke for 20 minutes, methodical, precise. The geography of the trail laid out with the clarity of someone who had walked it recently and paid attention. The gorge, the bridge, the ridge climb after it, the long descent into the port approach. She told him where the water sources were, where the ground was unreliable in the section after the gorge, where a particular section of the trail had been partially washed out and you had to take the high line above it. She told him where the trail marker system broke down and you had to navigate by landmarks instead. A particular rock formation, a distinctive tree species, the angle of a drainage channel that ran perpendicular to the path. She told him all of this without being asked to be thorough. She just was, naturally, because incomplete information struck her, apparently, as a kind of carelessness she didn't practice. When she finished, he said, "You're good at this." "At what?" "Describing terrain, reading it." He paused. "You've done a lot of this kind of traveling." She was quiet for a moment. "Yes," she said, "a lot." He didn't ask how she knew the bridge was damaged. He didn't ask what she'd been displaced from, or what was waiting for her at Kelvar, or why her hair was cut unevenly in the dark. He said, "Thank you for the terrain briefing, and for the ribs, and for finding my kit." She accepted this with the same slight inclination of her head. "You should sleep," she said. "Right side." He slept on his right side, and woke 6 hours later to find the fire rebuilt and her still in approximately the same position, the bark on her knee, the canopy lightening above them both. The second day was harder in the specific way she'd predicted. The bruising across his shoulder had bloomed overnight into something impressive, and getting up to his feet, the first time required some focused negotiation between his intentions and his body's counterarguments. But he got up. He moved around the camp perimeter slowly, methodically, testing what he could and could not do without the pain spiking, and by mid-morning he had a reasonable picture of his operational range. Sareth watched this without comment. She had rebuilt the fire and was doing something with her own pack, organizing, assessing, the careful inventory of someone managing a limited supply across an uncertain timeline. He noted that her supplies were slim. Not empty, but slim. The kind of slim that comes from being careful for a long time. "I have extra rations," he said. "From the kit, take what you need." "I have enough." "You've been here for 2 days feeding a human you found unconscious in a field. Your margins are different than they were." She looked at him, he looked back. After a moment she said, "A modest amount, thank you." She took what she needed, not more. Precisely what was reasonable, and organized it into her own pack with the same deliberate efficiency she seemed to bring to everything. In the mid-morning, with the pain at its manageable peak and the day settling into a long, unhurried rhythm, he asked, "What was the bark? What you were carving?" She reached into her pack and produced it. A map, rough but precise, the kind of thing you make when you need to remember a route. The gorge was there, and the bridge, and the landmarks she'd described to him the previous evening. She'd marked the water sources with small symbols, and the section of washed-out trail with a different mark. The high line around the washout was indicated with a dotted line above. "For me," he said, "in case we get separated on the trail." She turned it over and carved something on the other side, her own marks, smaller, a sequence he didn't recognize. Then she set it down beside her. He looked at it. The map was better than the mental image he'd built from her verbal description, more precise about relative distances, clearer about the relationship between landmarks. It was the kind of thing someone who had been navigating difficult terrain for a long time knew how to make, because they had needed them before and knew what they should contain. "You're very practical," he said. "I've had practice." Mid-afternoon, the charged particle event that was blocking the relay produced a visible effect. The sky in the east began to shift, faint bands of color moving slowly across the purple-gray, lavender and pale green at the periphery. It was beautiful in the objective, indifferent way of large natural events. They both watched it for a while from the edge of the depression. "Does that happen often on your world?" he asked. "My world doesn't have atmospheric events like this." A brief pause. "My world has a stable magnetosphere and very boring skies." "You miss it." She considered this with the same deliberate attention she brought to everything. "I miss specific things about it. The skies are not among them." "What do you miss?" Another of those long, considered pauses, real thought, not performance. "The food," she said finally, "and that there's no precise standard equivalent. The sound the coastal forests make in summer. The trees have hollow root systems and the wind moves through them and it produces a low, resonant sound. At dusk in summer, everything hums." He couldn't picture it, he tried. "That sounds worth missing." "Yes," she turned away from the sky. "What do you miss from your world?" He thought about it honestly. "Coffee," he said. "Real coffee, not reconstituted. And the smell of rain on dry ground." She nodded as though this was a reasonable answer, which it was. "Petrichor," he added. "I know that word," she glanced at him. "I told you, I learned standard from text." "From what texts?" "Everything I could find. I preferred the ones that assumed I didn't know the language at all over the ones that assumed I was already familiar with it. More honest, structurally." He almost smiled. "Makes sense." The ones written for children were particularly useful. They defined everything. They didn't assume any prior context. She looked back at the sky. "I liked them." He thought about her, 14 months ago or whenever it had been, reading children's texts in standard to learn the language well enough to function in it. The image had a particular quality to it, determined, thorough, not asking for accommodation. "You learned it well," he said. "I needed to." She said it as a simple statement of fact. If you can only speak one language in the Outer Rim transit system, you spend a great deal of time being misunderstood. "I decided not to do that." They stood in silence for a while, watching the atmospheric event color the eastern sky, and neither of them said anything about it being a strange situation. Two people with limited information about each other, stranded together on a world that wanted nothing from either of them, watching the light change. It was, in its way, companionable. The silence had the quality of having been earned. On the third day, he was well enough to help with the camp's small things, manageable things, the kind of useful he could be without aggravating the ribs. She accepted the help without ceremony. He gathered the water from the stream she'd identified on the second day. She filtered it. He organized the packs for travel. She checked the strapping and redistributed the load with quiet adjustments that he noticed and didn't comment on. It was efficient in the way that working with someone competent always is. The tasks distributed themselves without discussion, because both of them could see what needed doing. Late morning, he found himself sitting near the fire doing something he hadn't done in several years of frontier postings, which was nothing. Just sitting. The ribs were at their consistent low-level complaint. The camp was organized. There was no productive task available. He sat with his back to the warm rock face and watched Sereth move around the perimeter of the camp in the way she did when she was monitoring without actively surveying, a slow, casual circuit that managed to cover the relevant angles. She'd done this every morning, every evening. It was so habitual that she probably didn't notice she was doing it anymore. "How long were you walking before this world?" he asked. She completed the circuit before she answered. "Before Keth Doran, 4 months. I came from a junction station called Mire 3. That's deep outer rim." "Yes." She sat down on the other side of the fire. "Before Mire 3, a freight connection from Soren Hub. Before that, a ground crossing on Kelvethan." She said it the way you recite a route you know so well it's become automatic, not with the weight of complaint, just as geography. Each leg has its own complications. 14 months of complications. "Yes," she looked at the fire. "I have become very good at complications." Something moved in her expression, not quite wry, but adjacent. "I have also become very good at packing light and sleeping in short intervals." "Useful skills." "Not the ones I expected to need." She turned the bark over in her hands, the finished map which she'd kept. "I was a documentation specialist before. I maintained records for a regional administrative body on my home world, population registers, legal filings, historical archives." A pause. "I was very good at it. I liked it. The records were clean and organized, and when I left work in the evening I knew that the things I'd worked on were more accurate than they'd been in the morning." He listened to this without interrupting. "I was not," she said, "particularly well prepared for 14 months of walking across the outer rim, but it turns out that the skills are more transferable than I expected. Records and logistics are similar if you squint." The ghost of a smile. "The filing systems are worse." "The transition sounds difficult," he said. "The transition was not gradual," she agreed. "It was abrupt." She set the bark down. "The boundary conflicts in the third sector began in the 22nd month of the current compact accord. My world was in the jurisdictional gap. The administrative body I worked for was dissolved because it was no longer clear which authority it reported to. Most of the records I'd maintained were transferred to compact provisional storage, where they have been sitting without processing for 4 years, because the jurisdictional status is unresolved, and nobody wants to classify documents that belong to a population that hasn't been formally classified. He absorbed this, including the population registers. Including the population registers. She was quiet for a moment. Which is why the historical survey data from the Compact's Frontier Assessment Bureau would matter to the petition. If the survey records from the Third Sector Mapping Initiative contain population data from my world, counts, settlement records, resource assessments, that's primary compact documentation of our existence. Jurisdiction can dispute classification. It has a harder time disputing the fact of 6,000 people sitting in a survey database. He hadn't known this was where the conversation was going. He found that it clarified several things. "You understand the petition mechanics," he said. "I was a documentation specialist." For the first time, there was something dry in her voice. "I understand the petition mechanics very well. That is part of why I'm the one making the walk instead of staying at one of the junction stations and waiting for the process to work." She paused. "The process does not work without someone pressing it from the other end." He thought about what it cost to be the person pressing it, 14 months, slim supplies, a transport connection at Doreth Port, an atmospheric event on a world she was passing through. He thought about 6,000 people at the other end of the process. "The petition will go through," he said. She looked at him steadily. "You said that before." "It's still what I think." He met her gaze. "I've been in the Compact's frontier system for 6 years. I know what documentation can do." "So do I," she said. "That's why I'm here." "In the afternoon," she said. "In my people's documentation tradition, When someone acts to preserve the record of another person's existence, there is a specific term for it. I don't have a standard equivalent. The closest approximation is a witness who stays. He looked at her. That's what you're offering, she said, to go into the survey archive on behalf of 6,000 people whose records are in provisional storage, to look for the data that confirms we were there. She was looking at the fire. That's the term, a witness who stays. He thought about this. It was a heavier description than he'd offered it. He'd thought of it as a practical thing, a matter of access and a few favors. But she was right that it was more than that. A record is how you tell time you were here. A witness to it is how you make the record hold. Then that's what I'll be, he said. She looked at him for a long moment. Then quietly, thank you. They left at first light. He was functional, which was the honest word for it. The ribs had settled into a manageable, consistent complaint rather than the sharp protest of the first day. He could walk at a reasonable pace as long as he didn't torque suddenly or try to carry too much weight on his left side. Sarath had reorganized the load distribution between the packs without asking. His kit lightened. Hers adjusted, and he'd noticed and said nothing because she was right. The first 3 hours were through open ground, and the pace was steady. She walked ahead on the narrower sections and beside him where the trail widened, and she did something he'd noted in quiet people before. She paid attention. Not to him specifically, not in a watchful, assessing way, but to the whole environment continuously, the way someone does when they've learned that it matters, and the habit has become built in. She saw things before he did, a shift in the ground cover that meant soft footing ahead, a change in the canopy that indicated water nearby, and she noted them without fanfare, just a quiet word or a small gesture toward the relevant spot. He found, after the first hour, that he was doing the same, not consciously, just the natural result of moving with someone who was paying attention, so you paid attention too. It was the kind of traveling that makes you better at it. "How are the ribs?" she asked, around the mid-morning mark. "Functional," he said. "I'll tell you when that changes. There's a flat stretch in about 2 kilometers, good place for a break if you need it. I'll assess when we get there." He didn't need the break, as it turned out. They stopped briefly for water and continued. The trail was exactly as she described. The footing was consistent but required attention, and there were 2 sections where the marker system was absent and you navigated by the landmarks she'd specified. Both times, the landmarks were where she'd said they were. He noted this without comment. She'd been here, going the other direction, in conditions that had apparently not impaired her ability to observe and retain. The gorge reached them around midday, a significant cut in the landscape, the river running fast 40 meters below, the bridge a narrow affair of compact construction that had clearly been functional once and was now partially not. He stood at the edge and looked at the missing section, about 2/3 of the way across. The gap itself was not large, 2 meters, perhaps slightly more, but the lateral structure that would take you around it was narrow, and the edge of it over the gorge was not forgiving. "The lateral edge structure," he said. "Yes, the crossbar is intact. It's narrow, but it's solid. I crossed it 2 days ago." She was beside him, looking at the same gap with the same practical assessment. "The difficulty is the grip. You'll need to use both hands, which means shifting your weight through the left shoulder at the pivot point." He turned to look at her. She looked back. "I can do it," he said. "I know you can. I'm telling you about the grip because I want you to know about the grip, not because I think you can't." She picked up her pack and resettled it. "I'll go first. You watch the foot placement." She went first. He watched the foot placement carefully and the hand placement and the specific rhythm she used on the lateral section, weight forward, controlled, not hurried. At the pivot point her grip shifted in a specific way, both hands, brief weight transfer, then continuing. She crossed without difficulty and turned at the far end. He crossed. The ribs made themselves known on the lateral section when he had to shift his grip and lean slightly into the edge, a sharp, specific protest that he breathed through and did not stop for. The foot placement was precise. He'd paid attention. At the pivot point, the left shoulder informed him that it had opinions, and he acknowledged those opinions and continued, which was the only available response. His foot placement was exact. He'd been doing field work in difficult terrain for 6 years, and his body knew how to move through it even when it was disagreeing with him about the advisability of doing so. When he reached the other side, she was standing 3 steps back from the edge. Not at the edge, not hovering, 3 steps back, which was close enough to respond if something went wrong and far enough not to be in the way. "Good," she said. "Grip was the critical part," he said. "Yes." She turned and started up the ridge. He followed. The ridge climb was the hardest section of the day, steep enough that you used your hands at the upper portion, and his left arm had a firm opinion about this. He used his right hand primarily and let the left do minimal work, which was possible but inelegant. Sarath set a pace on the climb that was slightly slower than she probably walked on her own, and didn't say anything about it. At the top of the ridge, the trail leveled off and the view opened. Ahead, the long descent toward the port approach, and in the far valley, the outline of Doreth port visible through the haze. He stood at the top and looked at it for a moment. She stood beside him. "Tomorrow," she said. "Tomorrow," he agreed. They camped at the 20-kilometer mark, in a natural hollow she'd noted on the outward journey. The evening was colder than the first 3 days. The atmospheric event clearing had taken the residual warmth with it, and the temperature dropped fast after dark. They built the fire higher and sat closer to it, and the practical proximity of cold weather settled the question of distance that might otherwise have been a separate negotiation. She ate beside him and he ate beside her, and neither of them said anything much for the first part of the evening. The wilderness at night had its own sounds, not empty, busy, full of small movements in the canopy and the undergrowth that were not human sounds, that had nothing to do with either of them and required no response. After a while she said, "You didn't ask about the bridge." "What would I have asked?" "Why I knew it was damaged before we arrived." "Because you crossed it going the other way." He watched the fire. "You were already past Doreth coming in. You turned back when you saw the shaft collapse." A pause. "Yes." 14 kilometers out of your way." "Approximately." She turned the flat strip of bark she used for camp tasks over in her hands. "I saw you run from the shaft. I didn't know if you had somewhere to get to. I didn't know if you had another person with you. I went back to check." He thought about this, 14 kilometers out of her way, on a tight supply margin, 14 months into a journey that had already cost her more than she was going to tell him. He thought about the camp she'd built in 11 hours, the ribs wrapped with field-level medical precision, the kit retrieved from the dark and organized carefully beside him. He thought about 11 hours of sitting beside someone unconscious, watching his breathing to determine whether it was the kind of falling that ends in death. "I'm glad you did," he said. "I wouldn't have been able to continue knowing I hadn't." She said it the way she said most things, as a fact about herself, not a claim for credit. It would have been an error. An error. In judgment, in what I'm willing to be. She set the bark down. "I have made enough of those. I'm not interested in adding to them." He didn't ask what the previous errors had been. He thought about what it meant to talk that way, not as self-reproach, not as a bid for sympathy, but as a statement of current operating policy. The kind of thing you say when you've spent a long time deciding what kind of person you're going to be and have settled the question. "I understand that," he said. "I know," she looked at him. "You're also that way." "I noticed." "How?" "You didn't ask me anything I told you not to." A pause. "Most people ask anyway. They tell themselves they're being friendly or curious, or that surely I don't mean it that firmly. You didn't do that." "You meant it that firmly." "Yes." The corner of her mouth moved, not the not-quite smile, something quieter. "Yes, I did." The fire crackled. The canopy above was dark and full of that busy alien silence. "What's waiting for you at Kelvar?" he asked. He kept his voice even without pressure, not demanding, offering a space if she wanted it. She was quiet for a long time, long enough that he thought she wasn't going to answer and began thinking about what to say next. Then, a registration, formal. "My people, those of my people who made it, we have documentation pending at the Kelvar hub. Compact resettlement status if it comes through." A pause. "If the petition proceeds, there are complications in the third sector negotiations. My people are one of several populations caught in the jurisdictional gap." "How many of your people?" "Those still living, perhaps 6,000 across several worlds. We are a small people." Another pause. "We were larger." 6,000. From whatever number they'd begun with, before the boundary conflicts and the jurisdictional gap and the 4 years of processing limbo. He didn't say anything, because there wasn't anything to say that would be worth saying. "The registration will help," she said. "Compact status means access to the relay systems, to the transit corridors, to medical care without the workaround documentation we've been using. It means we stop being invisible officially." She looked at the fire. "That matters." "It matters a great deal," he said. She nodded slightly. "The complications may delay it another 6 months, maybe longer, but I have it from someone I trust that the petition will proceed. It just takes time." She picked up the bark strip again. "I have time. I've been spending time for 14 months. A few more months is manageable." He thought about what it cost to say that, to have learned to mean it. He thought about the documentation specialist who had worked in clean, organized archives, and the woman who had walked across the outer rim for 14 months and learned to read trail markers by landmark when the system failed. "You'll get there," he said, not as reassurance, as a statement about what he had observed of her, which was that she was the most methodical, precise, and quietly determined person he'd met in 6 years. She looked at him. "You don't know that." "I know you crossed a 14-kilometer detour to check on an unconscious stranger and spent 3 days making sure he didn't die of exposure," he said. "I know you crossed that bridge twice in 2 days. I know you walked 14 months across the outer rim on slim margins, and you're going to walk 3 more days, and then you're going to take a transit to Kelvar and file that petition and press the process from the other end until it moves." He paused. "I know that because I've been watching you move through difficult terrain for 3 days and you don't stop." She was very still. "You'll get there," he said again. She looked at the fire for a long time. When she looked back at him, something had shifted in her expression, not breaking, nothing dramatic, just the quiet change of someone who has been carrying something heavy for a long time and has, briefly, been allowed to set it down. "Thank you," she said. "It was the first time." "You said it first," he pointed out. "On day 1. The not-quite smile arrived. "Yes," she said, "I suppose I did." The second night on the trail, around the 40-kilometer mark, he woke at some point in the early hours and found that she was awake. She was sitting with her back against the rock they'd camped near, the fire rebuilt low, and she was watching the perimeter the way she always did, systematic, unhurried. He'd noticed she slept in shorter intervals than he did, light and easily broken. 14 months of sleeping in places where waking matters. He didn't say anything. He lay where he was and watched the sky, which was different here, different angle, different stars prominent, and after a few minutes she said, very quietly, "Sorry, did I wake you?" "No," he said. "Ribs." "Right side," she said, without inflecting it as a reprimand. I know," he shifted. "This is the position." A pause. She turned slightly to check the perimeter on her left, then returned to center. "In 2 days," she said, "you'll be at Dorath. The relay will be functioning by then. You'll have your pickup window." "Yes." "Your people will know where you are. My bureau contact will know I'm delayed. He's not the anxious type." Kale looked at the sky. "In 2 days you'll be at Dorath." "Yes." "And from Dorath to Kelvar is, what, a week on the transit corridor." If I get a direct connection, perhaps 10 days with the usual layovers. He ran the arithmetic, 10 days, and then the wait for the petition, which could be 6 months or longer. Do you have somewhere to stay at Kelvar while the petition processes? I have contacts at the hub, other families from my people who arrived before me. There are arrangements. A brief pause. It's not comfortable, but it's not uncertain. I know where I'm going. Good, he shifted again carefully. The bridge was the worst of it for the ribs. The rest of today was manageable. Tomorrow is the easiest day, mostly flat with a long descent into the port approach. If you take it at a steady pace, you'll be fine. You're good at this, he said. You said that already. I mean specifically the managing the situation so the person in it doesn't feel managed. You could have told me on day one that the bridge was going to be the hardest part. You waited until I'd had 2 days to rest, and then told me right before we left. She was quiet for a moment. Would it have helped you to know earlier? No, I'd have thought about it the whole time I was resting. Yes, a pause. I've traveled with people before. You learn the order in which information is useful. He thought about who she'd traveled with over 14 months. Groups of her people at various points, maybe, or single contacts along the route. Strangers who needed direction and could offer a freight connection. Sarath, he said. Yes. When the petition goes through, he paused, finding the right words. If there's documentation you need from the Compact's Geological Survey Bureau, references, attestations, data that could help with the jurisdictional case. My bureau has some access to the Third Sector survey records, not everything but some things. She was very still. I'm not offering you anything I can't deliver, he said. I'm offering you access to what I actually have access to, which is a Compact Class 3 survey credential, 6 years of frontier postings, and a bureau contact who owes me several significant favors. He paused. Survey data from the Third Sector Mapping Initiative includes population registers, historical ones, the kind of documentation that helps with a resettlement petition. A long pause. Why, she asked. Because you spent 3 days keeping me alive on a hostile world and you didn't ask for anything. He watched the sky. And because it's the right thing, and I have the access to do it. Another pause, longer this time. When she spoke, her voice was careful, not closed, but careful, in the way of someone who has learned that offers can be withdrawn. That kind of documentation could matter significantly, she said, for the petition. I know, he paused. Give me your contact at Kelvar. I'll reach out when I'm back on relay. She gave him the contact, a name, a relay code, a specific reference that would confirm she'd provided it. He noted all of it. She gave it clearly and without hesitation, which told him that she decided to trust this and was not going to be ambivalent about it. Thank you, she said, the second time. Thank you, he said, for the ribs and the camp. And the bark map, he paused, and the 3 days and the 11 hours before I woke up. She turned her head and looked at him in the low firelight. Her gold eyes were clear and steady and direct, the way they'd been when he first woke and found her watching the tree line. He was still not entirely sure, looking at her in this light, whether she knew what she looked like, the particular quality of her attention, the way she held herself, the precision of every movement and every word. She'd been a documentation specialist, and now she was a woman who'd crossed the outer rim on her own, and she was both of these things at once, completely. And he found that he was aware of this in a way he hadn't been 3 days ago when he'd woken up in the cold and found a stranger sitting beside him. The 11 hours, she said, were not difficult. He held her gaze for a moment. I'm glad, he said. She turned back to the perimeter. After a while he slept. He woke the final morning, before she told him to. He was aware of the light first thin and early, the sky still more gray than purple, and then of the cold, and then of the sound of movement nearby. When he opened his eyes she was already up, the camp half broken down, the packs reorganized. She'd let him sleep as long as she could without delaying their start. She looked over when he moved. "Good morning," she said. "Morning." He sat up slowly, methodically, the ribs still filing their consistent report. "Better than yesterday. Better than the day before. Camp's down." "Most of it." "Eat first." She handed him a ration pack and ate her own food standing, watching the canopy lighten by degrees. He ate beside her, also standing, because the ground was cold and standing was fine now, in a way it hadn't been 3 mornings ago. That was something. 3 mornings ago getting upright had been a project. Now it was just a thing he did. "It's getting better," she said, watching him stand without the careful negotiation she'd observed on the first day. "Incrementally," he said, "which is what was promised." 6 days, she said, "properly." 6 days, he agreed. The descent into the port approach was, as she'd said, the easiest day. The trail was well maintained on this side of the gorge, the footing reliable, the gradient manageable. They made good time. By mid-afternoon, the outline of Doreth Port was visible in the valley below. A mid-sized transit facility, functional rather than impressive. The kind of place that processed a lot of movement without caring much about the nature of it. They stopped on the ridge above it, where the trail leveled out before the final descent, and stood looking at it for a moment. "Your relay pickup will be from the facility's main hub," she said. "Level 2, eastern section. They have a compact bureau substation." "I know Doreth," he said. "I've passed through a few times." He looked at the facility for a moment, then at her. "Your transport connection." "Departure hub, western section. My connection leaves at the 3rd bell tomorrow morning." She paused. "I have lodging arrangements inside the facility." "Good." He shifted the pack on his shoulders. "Walk in together." She looked at him for a moment, the clear gold eyes, the same look she'd given him when he first woke up and found her waiting. Assessing him, though not the way it had been on the first day. On the first day she hadn't known yet what kind of person he was. 4 days and 60 kilometers later she knew. "Yes," she said, "walk in together." They descended the ridge and entered Doreth Port with the afternoon traffic, survey teams and transit passengers, and the various categories of people the outer rim collected, moving through the facilities levels with the practiced motion of transit. Cale navigated toward the compact bureau substation with his survey credential already in hand. She walked beside him until the fork in the facility's main corridor, where her route diverged west. "This is your direction," he said. "Yes." She stopped. He stopped beside her. The corridor moved around them, other people, other transit, other destinations, none of which had anything to do with either of them. "Contact the relay address I gave you when you're back on clear signal. The person at that address will know how to reach me." "I will." He paused. "Sereth." "Cale." He thought about saying several things. He settled for, "The petition will go through." She looked at him for a long moment. Then, for the first time in 4 days, she smiled, not the not quite smile, not the corner of the mouth shift, but a real one, brief and full and directed entirely at him. The mineral gold eyes warm with it. "You don't know that," she said for the second time. "I know you," he said, "same thing." She was quiet, then, "Get your ribs looked at properly. Immediately. And tell your bureau contact you need the 3rd sector survey archive access. Frame it as relevant to ongoing frontier posting conditions in the jurisdiction." That's impressively specific advice for someone who said she'd learned standard from text. "I told you, very thorough texts." She picked up her pack and resettled it. "Go, you'll miss the bureau substation window." He went. He was 200 meters down the corridor, headed for level 2, when he looked back. She was still standing at the fork, watching him, not anxiously, not with any weight of sentiment, just watching to make sure he got where he was going. As though finishing the job she'd started 4 days ago on a ridgeline, when she'd turned back 14 kilometers to check on a stranger. He raised one hand. She inclined her head. The slight, formal nod that he understood now was how she accepted things she was glad of. Then she turned west and walked. He was back on relay signal within the hour. The Bureau substation processed his position and updated his transit record and connected him to his contact, who was not the anxious type and said so, and then proceeded to ask 17 questions that suggested he had been, in fact, somewhat the anxious type after all. Cale answered them all and then requested access to the Third Sector Population Survey Archive, framing it exactly as Sarath had told him to, and filed the request. He also sent a relay message to the address she'd given him, signal clear. Bureau access request filed. Will confirm when approved. C***. The response came 3 hours later, as he was sitting in the facility's medical unit having his ribs properly scanned by an actual physician, who expressed strong views about the quality of the field wrapping someone had done, and then, upon closer examination, revised those views somewhat. The message read, received, departed Dorath on schedule, documentation will help significantly. S***. And then below that, in a second line. Thank you for the 3 days. He read it twice. Then he folded the datapad closed and sat with it for a moment, in the way you sit with something that is small and complete and means exactly what it says. The physician said, "Do you need a moment or can I continue?" "Continue," he said. He held the datapad in his right hand while the physician finished, and thought about a woman walking west through a transit hub, toward a connection that would take her to a station where 6,000 people were waiting for a petition to go through. He thought about 14 months and hollow-rooted forests that hummed at dusk. He thought about a bark map in his inner pocket with a route carved on one side and her own marks on the other, which he hadn't been able to read and hadn't asked about, and which he was going to keep. He thought about the way she'd said the 11 hours were not difficult, looking at him in the firelight with those clear gold eyes. He thought about waking up on the wrong side of a collapsed survey shaft with an alien sky above him and someone already there, already waiting, who had not needed to be. He opened the datapad again and typed, "The survey archive request has a 5-day processing window. I'll send confirmation to your Kelvar contact when it clears. For what it's worth, the bark map is in good condition. I'm keeping it." He sent it before he'd decided whether he was going to. The reply came back inside a minute, which meant she was still in transit range and had the datapad open. "It's a good map. You should keep it." S***. He smiled at his datapad, which was something he didn't often do. The physician, who was professionally obligated to notice things, noticed and said nothing. The ribs would heal in 6 days. The archive access would clear in 5. At Kelvar, a petition was working its way through a jurisdictional process that moved the way jurisdictional processes moved, slowly, with friction, towards something that would eventually matter. He sent one more message, "Get there safely." And after a moment her answer, "I know how to walk." He knew that was exactly why he'd said it. She knew how to walk, and she would keep walking, and the petition would go through, and 6,000 people would stop being invisible in the record, because she had been a documentation specialist once, and she understood what records meant, and she had decided 14 months ago that she was going to be the kind of person who does not add errors of judgment to the ones already made. He tucked the datapad into his inner pocket, beside the bark map. The physician cleared her throat. "All done," he said. "Thank you." He walked out of the medical unit into the functional, busy, indifferent hum of Dorath Port and thought, in 10 days she would be at Kelvar. In 5, the archive access would clear. In 6, his ribs would be healed. These were things that were going to happen, lined up in order, each one following from the last. He thought about a woman who had sat beside an unconscious stranger for 11 hours and then spent 3 more days keeping him viable, and who had said, when he'd thanked her, that it wouldn't have been something she could continue without doing. A witness who stays. He would do that. Whatever the survey archive turned up, whatever the compact's documentation system had recorded about a people caught in a jurisdictional gap 4 years ago, he would find it and he would send it, and it would be one more piece of a record that said, "They were here. They are here. The record can confirm it." He thought this was, probably, the most useful thing he'd been in 6 years of frontier postings. He walked toward the Level 2 relay station and sent his contact the archive request justification exactly as she'd specified, and waited for the confirmation, and kept the bark map in his pocket, and did not examine too closely the particular quality of a thing that is small and complete and means exactly what it says. Some things you recognize when you're ready to recognize them. He was working on it.